Hello, everyone. I'm Traci Arieli, end-of-life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Welcome to another episode. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Jim Van Buskirk, Final Exit Network volunteer and the editor of the anthology, There at the End, Voices from Final Exit Network. A few weeks ago, I had Final Exit Network, or FEN, on my program to talk about death with dignity. Today, we're going to share some of the deeply moving stories in this book and explore the important lessons they offer. These narratives illustrate the value of autonomy at the end of life, while also bringing to the surface the emotional and ethical challenges that come with it. So grab your favorite warm drink, get comfortable, and join us for the conversation. Jim, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start by sharing a bit about your personal journey and what led you to become involved with the Final Exit Network?
Absolutely. And in fact, I thought I would start by reading my essay that sort of triggered my whole journey, if that's okay.
That is fine.
Uh, this is the one that really put me on the map, put Fen on my map and put me on their map. Um, and it's of course included in the anthology. It's called Self-Deliverance and Bridge Traffic, and it was originally published in the magazine in 2018. So it's a little bit not out of date, but it has some historical. So this is what it looked like in the magazine. I first met Marilyn, not her real name, more than 2 years ago while holding open the side door of the Potrero Branch Public Library. The tiny woman was walking her dog down 20th Street and noticed my t-shirt, which read, "Let's talk about death." What's going on here, she wanted to know. When I told her that we were about to convene a death cafe, she immediately asked if she could attend, and her little dog, too. I have been co-hosting death cafes for more than 2 years, as well as reading voraciously, watching documentaries, and speaking to anyone and everyone about this taboo topic. Not that I consider myself an expert by any means, but as I become more comfortable, I'm on a crusade to help others deal with their cultural discomfort about our common destination. Perhaps that's why Marilyn invited me to accompany her on the next leg of her journey. A few weeks ago, she called to say that she had contacted Final Exit Network and asked me if I would be there with her when the volunteers guided her through what they refer to as self-deliverance. I immediately said yes, not knowing what this would entail or whether I was up to the task, and yet knowing that this was the next step in my learning curve. Marilyn was delighted, and I was honored and nervous. I didn't know Marilyn well, but gradually learned that the 88-year-old had been a renowned Jungian therapist, author, and workshop leader. Over many months, Marilyn enthralled, educated, and perplexed many of us with her talk of patterns, the importance of the Death Cafe in her life, and her frustration with her slowly diminishing capacities to drive, to see, and eventually, she feared, to think. Astonishingly, she continued to attend regularly, even after moving from the Wisconsin street house where she had lived for more than 45 years to a senior community residence across the bay in Oakland. "I don't like it over there," she said dismissively. "I hate that I have to go back to the other side." "You make it sound like you're crossing the river Styx," I teased her. "I might as well be," she agreed, before getting herself to a Bay Area rapid transit station to return to her new living quarters. After I agreed to witness Marilyn's departure, I spoke to Final Exit Network volunteers by phone. I was immediately calmed by their sense of purpose. They explained the process and assured me that self-deliverance was not illegal, quelling my anxiety about any legal liability. I didn't much like the term self-deliverance, only slightly preferable to suicide. After several phone calls and emails, Margaret and I had a plan and a date. I told a few friends what I was planning to do. One, a minister who had witnessed at least 50 suicides, many during the AIDS pandemic, offered helpful advice on what to expect. His counsel was invaluable. "What a beautiful day," I noted as I drove across the Bay Bridge. Marilyn was simultaneously calm and keyed up as I entered her apartment. Taking a friend's advice, I had not parked in the facility's garage and only feigned signing in. Marilyn had originally offered to give me a sculpture by a well-known artist, but I didn't feel comfortable being seen leaving her apartment carrying artwork. Instead, knowing that I was a librarian and a writer, she handed me a box with the complete set of her published books. While we chatted, Marilyn was amused that she repeatedly forgot the word that came after final. When I supplied it for her, she remarked with a rueful smile, "Isn't it funny? That's the word I can't remember." The Fen volunteers arrived precisely at 2:30 p.m. as planned, and I marveled at how patient, knowledgeable, and personable they both were. Because Marilyn could scarcely see, I read out the checklist of items while Marilyn impatiently agreed to each one. She articulated why she was intent on self-deliverance, reiterated that she knew exactly what she was doing, and was eager to carry out her task. We watched as she signed the document with determination. The volunteers then showed her how to assemble the equipment she'd ordered, instructing her step by step. Despite her request, they repeatedly declined to actually do anything for her, insisting that she accomplish each task herself. With persistence and a bit of frustration, she assembled the hood, taping the plastic tube inside and securing the bottom with a headband. She connected the other end of the tube to the regulator, which she'd screwed into the canister. The volunteers emphasized that it might not be elegant, but it would be effective. After Marilyn finished the sequence of tasks, she was asked again if she knew what would happen if she continued, if she wanted to change her mind, if she wanted to take a break. Adamantly, yes, no, and no. "Jim will be driving back across the bridge and there'll be traffic later," she said. I tried to explain that I was here for the duration and not to worry about my traffic, but she remained focused on the details as well as the big picture. I was impressed and inspired by her resolve. Once she had decided where she wanted the event to take place, on a daybed with a sunny view of the bay, all was ready. After the brief demonstration, the volunteers explained that Marilyn would lose consciousness in about a minute and that the entire process would take less than 15 minutes. Again, the three questions. Again, the impatient reply. With no ceremony or final words, the three of us watched as Marilyn turned the dial, pulled down the hood, and began inhaling. She closed her eyes as her breathing became shallow. One of the volunteers monitored her pulse. A few physical twitches, and soon she was gone. She looked peaceful. It was so sweet, simple, sad, and straightforward. I was moved by the simultaneously monumental and mundane moment of what we had witnessed. After weeks of careful preparation, the entire process took less than 2 hours from start to finish. I drove across the bridge, no traffic, and immediately joined Final Exit Network.
Mm, wow. So that was your real first experience with Final Exit Network. Whew, what a first experience. Most people don't have that as a first experience, I take it.
Yeah, it was really, as I say, profound and mundane and inspiring. And this essay appeared on the cover of the magazine. And I think that's sort of what launched me into the world of Final Exit Network, where I've been for 6 years.
Now, do the majority of Final Exit Network Fen volunteers, do they do the same thing? Do they accompany people to their final transition, to their self-deliverance, and educate them and then attend?
Exactly. Yes, they do, if that's what's desired. So uh, some people would prefer the presence of a compassionate stranger in addition to or instead of a family member, and others would not want a stranger. They would want either a loved one or perhaps to be by themselves.
What kind of training did you receive? I know this was your first instance of being with Fen, but after when you signed up to be a volunteer, what type of training do you get?
So I sort of did everything backwards, which is how I often do things. Um, So I was with another friend, not representing the organization, and was with her at her exit, similarly simple and straightforward and beautiful. And I was in communication with the head coordinator, and she and I would talk back and forth. And she happened to be in the Bay Area visiting her daughter. And she said, I think you might make a good volunteer. Can I meet with you? And she came over, sat in my backyard, and thrust this big notebook full of all the forms and the everything. I was like, and she said, give it a shot. If after a week or two you realize it's not a good fit, no problem, you can bail. And I was a nervous wreck initially. What am I allowing enough time? What if I say the wrong thing? What if the person on the other end of the phone isn't who they say they are? But slowly I started becoming more confident and realized that these people really are starving for a person to listen to them and take them seriously and not call them crazy and offer them options. So it's just been so fulfilling.
And, I know the book, you were the editor of this anthology, um, and it's filled with a lot of powerful stories. What was the process of collecting and curating these stories like? I know for me, reading them reading the book, that sometimes I had to stop because they were so emotional for me, and so it took me. It's a short book, but it took me a long time to read it. So, what was it like for you to actually curate that?
Well, I appreciate you saying that because this has been a long process for me. And after the book was published, which was weeks ago, I reread the whole thing. And I too, even though I've been working with this material for months and months and months, I was moved to tears at both each individual story, but also the collectivity of it. I think they start to build on one another and together as an anthology really create a portrait of who the Final Exit Network volunteers are, who the clients are, how grateful they are for our support services. So the process started when I realized the editor of the magazine and the president of the organization both kept stressing the power of personal narratives, personal stories. How are we going to solicit these? And I realized that we had at least one personal story in almost every issue of the magazine, and only Final Exit Network members get the magazine. So I went through, pulled out all of those stories, and thought, well, this is the core of a book. And I thought, well, I'll do some more interviews and I'll solicit some more essays. And then I looked at the timeline and realized, oh, Fenn is approaching its 20th anniversary. This is perfect timing. So after a few delays, the president uh, greenlit the project. And as I was working with a team, so I said, I have a lot of experience writing and editing. I have no experience publishing, so I don't want to be the project manager. So they assembled a team and we looked at it and thought, this is almost there. So I solicited essays from three major pioneers in the movement: Derek Humphrey, who originally founded the Hemlock Society; Faye Gersh, who was one of the co-founders of Final Exit Network; and Miriam Coppins, who has been active in the Right to Die movement since the 80s. But those were basically the only original essays that I felt were needed to flesh out the anthology.
Yeah, and I know that the Hemlock Society, for those that don't know, I won't say it morphed it didn't morph into Fen, it morphed into Compassion and Choices, I believe. And Fen is an
Yeah,
offshoot
right.
of the
Complicated.
organization. Yeah.
Yeah. And we don't go too much into that history. We have a little tree and we have a little bit of that narrative. But what I thought was important for this anthology is to show people where we are now, sort of a snapshot at our 20th year. And so, as Mary Ewart, our executive director, said, it's sort of a look at the past, the present, and a path to the future.
Yeah. Now, who contributed to the book?
So, as I say, most of the essays had appeared in the magazine over the last at least 15 years, if not more. So it was largely stories by volunteers of, of, of especially significant experience that they'd had, or in a few cases, cautionary tales like, oh my God, this really went south. Don't let this happen to you. And I wanted to include a few of those just as contrast. Um, and then a few people have written into the magazine, family members saying, thank you so much for what you did to our loved one. And in fact, the anthology closes with a couple of letters from clients. Before they died, they wrote very short passages to say how grateful they were for our support services.
Now, I know besides your introduction, your writing, thank you. And I think that do you have two writings in the book?
Well, actually, I think I have three.
Well, okay, so that's great. And I know you handpicked some other ones. Another one being a personal reflection on Autonomy by Lowry Brown. I was wondering if you could read a little bit of that.
Yes. And what's interesting about this one is so Lowry was the associate guide that I met in the story I just read. So, and she's now my supervisor. And the senior guide for that exit was Brian Reuter, who's now the president of the organization. So I really hit pay dirt in my very first exposure. But I wanted to read the first few paragraphs of Lowry's essay because I think it really situates the importance of Final Exit Network. It's called A Chosen Death, the Right to Write Your Own Life Story. A growing number of us feel that, when the time is right for us, death should be comfortably in our own hands, not in the hands of doctors or lawyers, priests or politicians. We want to be able to end our own lives in our homes at a time of our choosing without society getting its collective knickers in a twist that our considered personal choice is somehow an affront to, and I stumble here, how things are supposed to be. We are supposed to be living in small bands, hunting and gathering, and dying long before the age of 30. Let us dispense with fanciful imaginings of what is supposed to be, and instead consider what makes sense. Let us also dispense with any romantic notion of a natural death. We have always done everything in our power to wrestle death from the hands of nature. I had severe pneumonia as a newborn and was in an oxygen tent for days. That would have been my natural death. I took another stab at it in my 20s with a climbing accident that, without medical intervention, would have finished me. Whatever road to death I take, it is way too late for it to be natural. At a less philosophical level, is either life or death natural if you have medication supporting your circulation, or oxygen supplementing your breathing, a pacemaker guiding your heart, a caregiver spooning applesauce into your mouth because you no longer know how to feed yourself? The vast majority of us come to a point of physical or mental debilitation that we never would have reached had we lived and died naturally. The additional time to live is a wonderful gift of modern medicine, but does it oblige us to suffer past the point of blessing in indentured servitude to the medical establishment, to pay for that borrowed time? Must we then be cursed to endure exhausted, painful bodies or demented minds as some kind of penance?
Mm. Yeah, I could hear her voice as you were reading that. I could hear her voice. She has such a way of explaining things and writing, and I really appreciate her. And that story goes on and it talks about control. It's about control over one's life and death. How do you think this story aligns with the broader mission of Fen?
Well, I think it basically eh, explains it.
Yeah.
This is why we do what we do. And I should say that as a coordinator, so I've been trained as an exit guide, but I do not work as an exit guide. And what I find is that by listening to people, explaining what their options might be, that's sometimes enough control to know that somewhere down the line they might have some control over an uncontrollable situation. And that brings them enough solace. And I might never hear from them again.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes they call me back and it develops into a relationship, or they apply to the support services. But it's interesting how each individual case and each person's own evaluation of quality of life is different for them and can change over time.
I know that story moves on and it talks about some of the secrecy and fear surrounding self deliverance. How does Fen work to combat the stigma that still exists around these issues?
It's interesting because I just had a caller yesterday, a woman calling on behalf of her mother, and she just blurted out, "Well, why doesn't anybody know about Final Exit Network, especially if you've been around for 20 years?" So I think well, as you well know, there's a stigma about talking about death in any way. There's confusion about medical aid in dying, which the handful of states which offer that option, what the criteria is. Um, One of my colleagues, the aforementioned Miriam Coppins, told me that she was in a meeting with a physician who announced that he knew that Final Exit Network support services were illegal, which they completely are not. So everybody has pieces of information which may be incomplete, incorrect. So I've been doing a series at the public library trying to explain to people how this works, why this is important. Hopefully, no one will need these services, but to know that they exist and to know what the protocol is, maybe they have a friend or a loved one who would benefit from knowing about it.
Now, I know that this work is very emotionally challenging. How do you and your fellow volunteers find balance to maintain your emotional health while doing this work?
That's a really good question. And my minister friend, who I referred to in that first essay, was quite concerned when I started getting involved. And he said, "Well, I think you're going to need a counselor or a therapist because this is very intense, as you're suggesting." And I really took him to heart. And I realized that rather than being draining, which I thought it might be, it's actually so fulfilling and so inspiring. Um, and I am so impressed with the people I talk to who I wouldn't ordinarily come into contact with. And sometimes, and often we laugh together, myself and the callers, and I say, "Well, I can't believe we're laughing." And they'll say, "Well, what am I going to do? Cry?" But it's deep, authentic laughter. And once in a while, I hang up the phone and burst into tears. Um, and we are a really good support system for one another. So if I have a question I can't answer or a person who's difficult to work with, I can call any of my colleagues, and usually I lean heavily on Lowry as my supervisor. And we sort of have a running joke now. Just when we think we've heard everything, comes a new wrinkle or a new question or something that we haven't considered. So it really is a network, and the volunteers are all over the country. We have regular meetings and we compare stories, and it's really a safe place for us to decompress and realize we're all in this together. And the people we talk to, I always have to remind myself they may not be at their very best, as they're getting getting angry with me or frustrated or impatient or whatever they're getting. But I have one friend who I tell some of my stories to, and he says, "Oh, Jim, I don't think I could do what you're doing." And I said, "Well, Richard, I don't think I can not do what I'm doing."
It's definitely a mission. It's definitely something, a calling that you're driven to do. And I love how you talk about having those authentic conversations, not only with the clients that you talk to, the people that you're helping, but with the people that you work with. I know that when I transitioned over from tech to doing this work, the death care work, that I found those conversations very authentic. And I can't go back to having excuse my language, the bullshit conversations that I have just no tolerance for it anymore.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what I've found is that these are incredibly immediate, intimate conversations about maybe the most important thing in the world. And my partner likes to tease me, he said, "Oh, you're so sensitive and compassionate and patient and understanding. And why can't you exhibit those qualities in our relationship?" So I'm trying to, he's teasing me a little bit, but so I feel like I'm learning how to be a better human by working with these people and talking to them.
So let's talk about Carol and Althea's story. Did I pronounce her name right? Althea?
Yes.
Yeah. And I believe that, personally, I believe that after a person turns 18, they should have an advance directive and appoint a healthcare representative. And that healthcare representative really needs to be able to advocate strongly. And I think that this story is a good example of why this is important.
So this piece is called Death Was Her Last Frontier by Althea Halchuk. And Althea was a Final Exit Network's surrogate consultant and wrote this piece with the two women's name. With sorry, uh, she wrote this piece with their permission. Carol wrote to Althea, "My best friend of 50 years, Evelyn, is a patient in a large Boston teaching hospital. Doctors are not respecting her or me as her healthcare power of attorney or following her advance directives. I need your help. Evelyn has nearly a dozen severe comorbidities and has endured continual pain for the last 15 months while recuperating from 3 surgeries. She is very clear about her end-of-life wishes, which we've discussed many times. No more surgeries, no intubation, no artificial feeding, no resuscitation." Several days ago, after a 911 call, Evelyn was transferred to her treating surgeon. "I was told she had consented to surgery, requiring intubation. During an 8-hour operation, they discovered a blood clot and suspected part of her bowel might have died. She was in critical condition and the prognosis was hour by hour. On day 2, she was extubated. On day 3, she was up doing physical therapy, but in lots of pain. We immediately updated her DNR and pulsed physician orders for life-sustaining treatment, indicating comfort-focused treatment only and no resuscitation. She didn't stabilize, the pain increased, and the doctors decided, without asking for consent, to withdraw food and oral meds to keep her bowel recover, to help her bowel recover, requiring a feeding tube. They then installed a PICC, peripherally inserted central catheter, line to give her nutrition and medication. They claimed Evelyn was on the road to recovery. Conflicted as I was, I didn't want to withdraw treatment, which would mean certain death. 2 weeks later, the attending surgeon called to say immediate surgery was needed to uncover the cause of her pain, suspecting a dead bowel. She claimed if Evelyn didn't have this surgery, she would likely suffer a long, slow death from sepsis. Although she had consented to the surgery, doctors weren't sure she understood, and they wanted my consent. Despite my better judgment, I agreed. An hour later, her nurse called and said when they came to take her to surgery, she didn't want to go and was kicking and screaming, but they took her anyway. I immediately called the operating room to withdraw consent. Realizing I needed Final Exit Network's help, I promptly placed a call requesting Althea's help. Within an hour, on a conference call, the treating and attending surgeons pleaded with me to consent to 2 possible operations. The treating surgeon said this was a fixable condition and then they could go in and take a look-see. The other surgeon said, I can't agree. But the treating surgeon refused to take no for an answer and proceeded to discuss procedures and argue. He applied additional pressure, saying he would not give her huge doses of pain meds to let her die or put her in hospice. Finally, the anesthesiologist said, I know her. I participated in her last 3 surgeries. She wouldn't want this. With that, I firmly cut off discussions with their promise to transfer Evelyn to comfort care with no surgery. Later that evening, the attending surgeon called to say, I think we made the right decision. I was confused, as she had advocated for surgery until the last minute. The following morning, she called to say the treating surgeon had talked Evelyn into an operation, but the attending physician didn't think she was competent to decide. I demanded a call from the treating surgeon. While Althea listened in, the doctor again pleaded for surgery. He had an answer for every question and objection I had about bad outcomes. He was not going to transfer her to hospice, period. I told him firmly, yet again, Evelyn's wish was for no treatment. He finally agreed to call in palliative care. I spoke with the palliative care team, and it was a complete and complex phone call with no pushback. They reiterated that I had full control to make the decisions. They were totally supportive to immediately withdraw antibiotics and feeding, confirming what Althea had said about my right to decide things. Still, after all this, palliative care had to wrest control from the treating surgeon because he claimed the team was still debating whether to put Evelyn with hospice. When I walked into her room the next day, she said, thank goodness that you're here. I can go now. Finally, after many weeks, I enrolled her in hospice. I had to advocate every step of the way to ensure she was receiving adequate pain medication. After 6 days in hospice, she peacefully passed.
Mm. That is such a good story to illustrate sometimes what advocacy is about, you being the healthcare representative and really having to push. And thank goodness that anesthesiologist spoke up. That was very brave of that doctor to do, because many would not speak up. So it was, good on that, good on him. But that is really a good representation, I would say, of what the healthcare representative needs to do. You've had, in your experience, how common is this situation, and what are the best ways for people to prepare for this scenario?
Well, since I don't have direct involvement in that, I don't know how frequent it is, but my impression is that it's more frequent than we would want it to be, certainly. And what I encourage people to do, and you likely do as well, is to have as much documentation in place in as many different forms with as many different people as possible, so that there's none of this uh, pushback and arguing. And this was an emergency situation, but not an acute emergency situation. But to have named a healthcare proxy who is a bulldog and is going to do, as Carol did, really fight for what she knows that Evelyn wanted and didn't want. And also to have those discussions repeatedly with either family members or friends, or certainly with physicians, because, as we know, they are trained to keep us alive, and they are not adequately trained to deal with the inevitable that we might not want every last ditch effort made. And so to have a POLST in place, to have an advanced care directive, and to make sure everyone has a copy of the advanced care directive. And I like to tell a story about my partner when we were redoing our advanced care directives during the pandemic. And I said, I'm thinking about not naming you as my medical proxy because you're not the most assertive person I know. And he responded and said, I realize that I'm not assertive on my own behalf, but I can guarantee you I will be assertive on your behalf. And that's what I needed to hear because I want somebody who's going to say, no, he does not want that intervention. Um, so it's it's unnecessarily challenging, and we have to advocate for ourselves, as you know, on an ongoing basis.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to know, do you have any other chapters or any other experts that, anything else you wanted to read?
Well, I'd like to read a very short one of the expressions of gratitude from these are both anonymous. I'll just read one um, called "Words Cannot Express." Words simply cannot express how grateful Joe and I are for your help at such a monumental moment in our lives. You are the angels we have been praying for. Thank you for making this moment a beautiful experience for us. This is the last moment we will have on this earth together. You have given Joe his dignity, and you have given us a calmness and allowed us to do this together on our own terms in the privacy of our own home, where we have lived together for over 20 years. You will now have another angel looking over you, and I have now become a permanent member of your organization. I will continue to support what you do through donations. What you do is so crucial to people like me. I will never forget what you have given us. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Mm.
And I think that says it all.
Yeah, it's all people could hope for and want, really, at the end of their lives, to be with their loved ones and to have control of how they live their final moments, that final chapter. Mm.
And many people I talk to say, oh, blithely, I'm going to Switzerland. And then when it comes later in the process, really? Is that a viable option?
Yeah.
Not for a lot of people.
Yeah, not for most people. That takes a lot of money, and we forget how most people in the United States live. So, one last question. What thoughts or messages would you like to leave our listeners with regarding the book and the work of Final Exit Network?
Well, I so appreciate having been invited onto your program to let people know about our mere existence and what we do and who we are. And we're not some shady organization. We've been around for 20 years. And one of the things I wanted to tell you is that I've just been invited by the San Francisco Public Library, and I'm a retired librarian. So on Tuesday, September 17th at 6 o'clock, we're having a big blowout book launch party at the main library. And so it will be me and one of my colleagues who has a piece in the anthology, and she works as an exit guide. And together we're going to sort of explicate what we do, who we are, how it works, just to bring greater understanding, as I say, for one more option as people are considering their end of life choices.
Great. And that's September 17th.
Right.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Jim, thank you so much for being on the show. How can our listeners learn more about Final Exit Network and get a copy of your book?
Well, go to finalexitnetwork.org, and it's a wonderful, beautiful website with lots and lots of information, supplemental advanced directives for dementia, for example, or conversation starters, because not every family is ready to start discussing these things. Lots and lots of information. And right there on the homepage, click this link and you can buy a copy of There at the End, Voices from Final Exit Network.
Thank you so much. So, folks, today's discussion focused on autonomy, dignity, and the choices we face at the end of life. These conversations, though difficult, are essential. They help us understand and respect each other's journeys and decisions with compassion and understanding. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you found this conversation to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Traci Arieli from Comforting Closure, wishing you peace and comfort in your journey. Until next time, take care.